Please go ahead.
Okay, we are live now.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so good afternoon to everyone. I have great pleasure in welcoming all the eminent speakers today at this very important webinar on self code of conduct and standards for Indian direct selling industry. Today we have a very strong panel of experts. Madam Chavi has already introduced each and everyone, and we are really lucky to have such a knowledgeable people with us today on this very technical topic, and the subject which the industries are demanding, or sometimes we have been talking, but today the day has come when we can discuss at length and then come with certain solutions, suggestions from the experts. So I also welcome all the audience, all the participants, and I will request all the participants to write their questions midway as the discussion goes on, so that we can, these can be answered by the concerned experts. And with this, I request Madam Chavi Ahmed to kindly moderate the session, and we can begin the discussions, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Rajora, and thank you, Mr. Rajora, so much for giving us this opportunity again. The industry loves to get together because we are an industry where we like to meet people. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we are unable to meet. So I really appreciate the efforts of ASSOCHAM for doing a webinar series every month and take the industry forward even in these uncertain times. So now beginning for, I welcome everyone. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a privilege that for all of us to participate over here. Indeed, as Mr. Rajora said, we have a very learned panel, and we will specifically speak about self-code of conduct and standards for the Indian direct selling industry. This has also been done because just on 6th August 2019, a new Consumer Protection Act has come, which has adopted the direct selling guidelines, which has given more teeth to the guidelines. And Mr. Anand Patwardhan will add to the more details about the act, so that we all can learn and see what best we can do in the current scenario. So now, not moving forward, I will talk about the panel, and I will introduce the panel. Dr. Ashish Gupta, thank you so much for joining us. He's a professor at IIFT, and his knowledge on this subject is going to be a very big value addition to the forum. Then we have, after that we have Mr. Ashish Gupta. He's director of Altos India and is very young and enterprising. He's just changed the whole look of Altos, and we look forward to listening to his views as well. Subsequently, we have three ladies, and all of them, three ladies with us today, which is a big surprise, because even when we look at webinars, we see more men, or we see just one lady or so. So I'm very delighted to have these three ladies. Roberta, she has joined from Brazil. She is also the direct seller. She was the head of direct selling association in Brazil. She's a lawyer by profession and has a lot of knowledge on code of conduct. We also have Nirupunga, who is a torchbearer for the industry and is associated with research from 2010 on the subject matter. She's also done many reports, and one of them is socio-economic impact report. And even 2 years back, she did full research on what regulation should come for direct selling industry. Though our focus today will be mainly on consumer protection. We have Suchitra, who has also done a lot of research in consumer affairs subject matter, and is also a lawyer at Chennai. It's Sai University. And we have very experienced person from the industry, Mr. David Stanley. He has a lot of experience, and he has worked with both international, and now from last 5 years he's running his own company, Helix International, which has really added value to the Indian direct selling industry. Welcome Roberta. I will introduce you again. Roberta is joining us from Brazil, so we took some time, and she is going to also talk about how we can benefit on having a specific Indian standards Indian code of conduct for the direct selling industry. So moving forward, I request Dr. Ashish Gupta to share his views. He also has to leave early because he has some other engagement. So I request him to give his views on the subject matter of self-code of conduct and standards for the industry. Welcome, Dr. Ashish.
Thank you, Mohan, for inviting me to the discussion. And I would like to thank Mr. Gupta for giving this opportunity to discuss this issue on self code of conduct for Indian direct selling industry. Indeed, is a very need of the hour to have a discussion upon this self code of conduct. And I would like to begin my views one of the quote of Mr. Jaguar, which said that good business leaders create a vision, articulate the vision, and passionately own the vision, and they drive it to the completion. So every business has certain vision, but without the conduct, without laying the foundation with the regulation and the code of practices, vision will not drive. So, indeed, encouraging to find that the direct selling industry has found its ground economy and growing value perception of the consumers, and the people are aware now, and increasing the accessibility of the product and the growing demand of these smaller towns of the Indian economy. And globally, if you see, the industry is continuously achieving the new targets and paths. And when we talk about the specific code of conduct, so the code is not something which is law, but probably which require a level of ethical behavior from companies, from the seller, which connotes expectations, or which determines the scope of the business organizations. I can remember one consumer policy toolkit which is introduced in 2010 by OECD, which provides a framework for improving the development and implementation of policy measures to address consumer problems. So, on similar ground, many companies adapted that model or consumer kit to address consumer issues, specifically in industries where the direct selling or direct interactions of the companies happen. And if you see the growth aspect of the industry since 2018, then 18 to 20, the industry is continuously growing approx about 184 billion globally. The minority market share, which is captured by the wellness category, which is approx 33% share globally, that we talk about, and only the category which is actually entering the main market, which is happiness, and many selling agencies are focusing into this segment. When we look at the self-regulatory code or the need for the self-regulatory code, so I believe that code should be implemented or should be taken at the three level. And first, in my opinion, conduct protection for the consumers, and then code of conduct towards the sellers, and the third, the code of conduct should be for the customers. So here there are three main initiative of code one is actually buying the consumers. Second is direct seller, who is actually keeping the material and supplying the material products to the consumers, and they also continuously interacting and buying the stocks from the companies involved in such type of businesses. So when we come to the code of conduct for the protection of consumers, so a few points I have in mind that I would like to share with you that should be kept before we any document for self-regulatory code for Indian direct selling industry. Maybe further they can be defined in the later part, but we should have something which is concrete to work upon. Like the most important dimension of the code of conduct or consumer is pro practices. What type of activity should not use wish that actually are misleading or deceptive or unfair sales practices. Any should talk about the prohibited practices, and the practices should be implemented at ground level. The next important thing for consumer protection of is that identification. Uh, Identification means that initiation of sales presentation or without request, any seller cannot approach. There should be very guidelines that they should provide the information very clearly. The purpose of the business should be maintained, and ethics. The more important is ethics and how ethically direct sellers are behaving in the market. The next point of discussion could be on demonstration and explanation of the products, how they are explaining and demonstrating the products, the payment, the cooling off period, the return policies, the number of things that which comes, which is sometimes customers are not aware of. And because this model is more of interaction, more of where people believe on referrals, people believe on word of mouth, so hence they don't go in detail sometime that terms of guarantee after sale, and many people are not aware of, so that some literacy, some explanation should be there when we talk about protection consumer and code of conduct and self regulation for the consumers. Then we should talk about the fairness and the respect of privacy. Like privacy is one of the most serious concerns these days. India still do have many strict policies that can protect the information, specifically the personal information of the consumers. Just few minutes ago, I have read that some of the information on Instagram and YouTube is breached, somewhere up to 35 million this information is breached. So still we have to get the validation of this source of that, whether this is a true information or not. But this is serious concern. How the company or some of the organization can do this activity without consent or taking consent sometime. So in this type of business where direct seller capture the personal information, telephone numbers, email IDs, and they actually continuously remind the consumers to purchase the product. But using the private information to some extent is fine, but it is specifically for the business purpose, not for any kind of which actually lead to or mislead or misuse of the information. And the next important aspect that I would like to highlight that is referral seller, especially in such type of businesses when companies and direct sellers introduce a product, and upon the presentation that a consumer can reduce or recover the purchase and the reduced purchase price by discount. So that reduction is actually based on some referrals, and people refer to other persons, and that reference actually have a individual put in the call availing shortest discount. So isn't feasible to promote the referral segment when the rest of the another person are the first person enjoying the benefits. So this is also few important concern that deals with the conduct for consumers about what I told you. Another aspect of the selection highlight is about direct sellers. So it should be the compliance. How the company, what kind of compliance conditions, membership in the distribution system, and what are the standards should be there, so that there should be a strict sales compliance the direct seller that must follow if they want to remain into the business. And they should report, some reporting mechanism should be formed, and every quarter or every every year report to that forum or some specific association or body which actually sees transparency maintained by the direct seller in following the
Any other point, Dr. Ashish, you would like to mention? You mentioned about
with
fair, because your line which we are listening is coming little break.
unfair
It's
recruitment
unaudible.
practices or
So we are
misleading
unable to hear Dr. Ashish.
recruitment practices where they am I audible? Hello.
Yeah, you are audible, but Dr. Ashish, your voice is fluttering. It is audible in between, but there were gaps when we couldn't hear you.
Oh,
So the last point, if you can
okay.
just repeat.
Oh. My last point was that the seller's compliance, the direct seller compliance, that the company require to have certain mandatory membership or distribution system to comply the certain standards, and at the association or the industry body should develop code so that they have the reporting system, the mandatory reporting system, whether they are following those industry compliances or not. Otherwise, they lose the membership. So there should be a strict seller compliances if the company wants to remain in that business. And another point I highlighted, that is the recruitment of the that people do that business, and sometimes unfair recruitment practices followed by the direct sellers. So money paid by the direct seller to the recruiters, and the recruiters also have certain to the business, and sometimes the businesses are also confused with the pyramid scheme, where in that pyramid
Dr. Ashish, again, you are not audible to us.
they get certain reward. I'm audible. Hello.
No, you were not audible for the
Hello.
last. Yeah, Dr. Ashish, you were not audible for the last 1 minute.
Oh,
You were talking about best recruitment practices.
yeah, I'm talking about the best recruitment practices, and but I talked about compliances, the seller compliance. Then I talked about I'm talking about the coordination or relationship with the companies if they buy any unsold or resellable product inventory. So these are the few things that are important when we talk about the conduct toward direct sellers.
Excellent. Okay, so Dr.
In the
Ashish,
it
thank you so
comes
much for your feed. You've actually helped us to set the tone for the entire thing. Now I request the next speaker, Mr. Abhishek Gupta
yeah.
from Directed Altos India, to share his views on this and how we can make a consumer oriented code of conduct for India.
Thank you, Chavi ma'am. Dear industry colleagues, before I start my dedication, I would like to take the opportunity to thank ASSOCHAM for envisioning a webinar on self-code of conduct and standards of direct selling industry. I have always been a firm believer in the business principles expounded by our father of nation, Shri Mahatma Gandhi ji, in which he said, a customer is the most important visitor on a premises. He is not dependent on us. We are dependent on him. He is not an interruption of our work. He is the purpose of it. He is not an outsider of our business. He is part of it. We are not doing him a favor by serving him. He is doing us a favor by giving us an opportunity to do so. I appreciate the point which has been articulated by Dr. Ashish Gupta and Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, which are too informative. Direct selling guidelines are a landmark of our direct selling industry, which has been released by Ministry of Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution, and it has benefited all the stakeholders, that is customers, direct sellers, and the industry at large. See, our direct selling industry is a 10,000 crore industry because of the perseverance and the hard work of our direct sellers. I would now take the opportunity to share how these guidelines have benefited our industry. I believe that, and I'm sure everyone in this meeting must be believing that consumer is the soul and the consumer is the core of the direct selling guidelines 2016. Now, I would like to share the valuable points keeping in mind the time given to me. My first point is direct selling guidelines has given a definitional clarity to the business of direct selling in India. Consumers and direct sellers are the biggest beneficiary of the direct selling industry. Direct selling guidelines has ensured accountability in the operations of direct selling entity in India, though still more clarification is needed to protect us from fly-by-night operators. Guidelines have codified the interests of the consumers by ensuring that conduct of direct selling entity is fair and transparent as well. While structuring these guidelines, policymakers have taken into the cognizance the responsibility of direct sellers and have made them accountable under the clause 5 of direct selling guidelines and have laid a framework for their conduct with the consumers as well. Now, my points have the essence of direct selling guidelines, and I would also like to thank Consumer Affairs Minister Shri Ramvilas Paswan, former Secretary Mr. Hem Pandey, and Mr. Zakir Hussain, the Director of Affairs, for playing a visionary role in formulation of direct selling guidelines. We at Altos are a customer-centric direct selling entity and a responsible corporate citizen. Further, I'm delighted to inform that after the adoption of direct selling guidelines, our business has grown and we as a direct selling entity have earned more trust and goodwill from our stakeholders. Even after the release of direct selling guidelines, there are challenges which still persist for the direct selling industry. But however, I strongly believe that forms like these are a stepping stone for turning challenges of industry into opportunity. I eagerly wait to hear the viewpoints of other panelists as well, and again would like to thank ASSOCHAM for providing me an opportunity to speak in this webinar. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Very crisp, Abhishek. It was a very crisp and to the point, and you have covered everything. I am really thankful to Dr. Ashish and also Abhishek for showing us the way for the tone of this entire discussion. Now I request Advocate Patwardhan to share his views that how, because I feel that with the new act coming, there are a lot of there is some complications which have come for us as a customer to resolve. So probably he can show light how we can help the customer and how we can help the direct seller, because direct seller is also now the product seller. So over to you, over to you, Mr. Patwardhan.
Thank you, Chavi. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, Mr. Patwardhan. Yes.
Thank you very much for making me a part of this wonderful webinar that you arranged. It does have a lot of meaning today, particularly in the light of way the entire industry has changed and the way you need to be addressing and keeping them satisfied. I think that's one of the major issues for which the old Act of 1986, the Consumer Protection Act, had to be changed with a new Act of 2019. The basic objects of the Consumer Protection Act 2019 was to overcome the changes that time has brought about in the way the markets operate today. So that's one of the most important part, as well as markets for goods and services have undergone drastic transformations since the enactment of the Consumer Protection Act of 1986. The modern marketplace contains a plethora of products and services. Emergence, global service chains, rise in international trade, and rapid development of e-commerce have led to new delivery systems of goods and services and have provided new options and opportunities for consumers. So I think we need to give and address this issue so that there's a proper balance between the sellers and the satisfaction of the consumers, which is ultimately the aim for both the sides of this coin to be together and survive successfully. Basically, here the whole idea now has changed, not merely from in the sense where the consumers would have some cause of action, but it would also give rise by having another separate CCPA, that's the Central Consumer Protection Authority, that has been introduced, which is meant for overlooking any kind of misleading advertisements or for sale of any spurious goods. Here they would be having an independent investigation agency. Apart from any complaint that any consumer can make, they would be having an independent agency which would be following up with the kind of misleading advertisements, and particularly with case of people who are endorsing. We invariably have star-studded advertisements these days with sports personalities as well as film personalities who come up and endorse certain products. Such kind of endorsement done, which is found to be either misleading or incorrect in any way, would have the person, that personality himself, the one who is endorsing, to face certain penalties which can go right up to 10 lakhs of rupees. Besides that, if there is any specific direction, such as modification of any advertisement or directly preventing any particular advertisement from being advertised any further, such kind of issues are also to be addressed by the CCPA, the Central Consumer Protection Authority. And in such cases, there can be very serious implications where such an endorser can be banned for a particular 1 year or up to even 3 years, besides even having some penalty imposed upon him. Notwithstanding that, in case of any situation where any such product is spurious or is not as per to its standards as is being advertised, even such kind of products if sold. So it's now a situation where it's not just the manufacturer, but in line, even the distributor, seller, advertiser, all of them would become responsible and liable as well for selling spurious goods to the extent of harm. If that harm is even causing death, punishment can be up to life imprisonment. Such kind of new provisions have been brought in this new enactment. What is very important here is with regard to certain new definitions that have been brought in, particularly the definition of, let us say, e-commerce, misleading advertisements, product liability, the endorsement, electronic service provider, direct selling, all these are now specifically defined. When you look at section 213, direct selling means marketing, distribution, and sale of goods or promotion of through a network of sellers other than through a permanent retail location. What is another very important factor with this new amended Consumer Protection Act is wherever the complaint can be filed for all these days was where the opposite party, that means the seller or manufacturer against whom you are filing a case, he carried on business or resided. Now that situation has changed, where a consumer can file a complaint not only where the cause of action arises, but even where the consumer resides. The whole concept here was developed because sitting in his residence, he has placed an order, and by that order has got delivered to him at his residence. If he is not satisfied with that particular order, then the cause of action would arise from his residence itself. So that would make a very big issue, because there would be consumers all over the country, and if complaints were to be filed all over the country, the sellers, particularly e-sellers and e-commerce that we are seeing, would be required to address all those complaints all over the country. So that's a very important aspect which we need to take care of as this new Consumer Protection Act has come into force. Then express warranty is another very important definition that has been brought in. If you are making any particular representation, if you are going to give out a product saying that this has these particular qualities, if that fails, that would definitely attract not only punishment by a complaint to CCPA, but where a consumer can also file a complaint seeking not just refund but also maybe compensation. Going by the word compensation, the next aspect that has been introduced now is where we have particularly product liability. This is something where it's going to be a very important issue from the seller's point of view. A product liability under section 2 subsection 34 means the responsibility of a product manufacturer or product seller of any product or service to compensate for any harm caused to a consumer by such defective product manufactured or sold, or by deficiency in service related thereto. All this time, we are also often faced with what is the difference between a guarantee and a warranty. The warranty would be that for the product, but the guarantee would be that the product functions for which it is made. So I think that kind of a product liability has been now brought into this particular act. So whenever anybody is going to sell any product, he must ensure that whatever he's projecting, whatever he's selling, whatever he's representing, that is perfectly what this particular product can do or will be able to do. This is one of the aspects which is quite serious, because it's not only the manufacturer, but it is also going to be the seller, and the direct sellers through e-commerce mode or any other mode would also be held responsible. These are some of the very new changes that have been brought into the Consumer Protection Act. I would like to end, of course, leaving open for consumer any question answer sessions that may come later, by saying that I'm also associated with Council for Fair Business Practices, and I'm on the board of directors of the same. Our vision is to create an environment where business confidence is built through best business practices and is fostered in an atmosphere of trust and respect between the providers of goods and services and their users for the ultimate benefit of the society and the nation. Our mission is we shall promote the highest ethical practices by businesses and professionals in order to provide complete satisfaction to consumers and other stakeholders. So this was what was envisioned in 1966 by some of the top manufacturers, where this particular association was born on 2nd of October 1966, where JRD Tata, Ramkrishna Bajaj, Mr. Kurakiwala, Mafatlals, Birlas, these kind of people who came together and have started and formed this particular association. So the whole concept here is a person, the consumer, should ultimately get his value worth for what he has spent and what he has expected when he is buying a product. Thank you.
So, thank you so much, Advocate Patwar. I want to ask you one particular thing. Like, would you elaborate on the definition of consumer which has come in the Act?
Yeah.
Because
As a consumer, the consumer is a person who purchases, who buys any goods or services, whether by actual payment or by a deferred payment or under any such scheme, and doesn't limit itself to the person who is paying for it, but also the beneficiary who would be using that product or service under license from the person who has paid for it. That's the definition of a consumer. And well, as far as the consumer is concerned, a person who purchases goods and products for resale or for commercial purpose would not be a consumer who can use or come under the consumer make use of the Consumer Protection Act for his grievances that he wants redressed.
Thank you so much, Advocate Anand. It was very nice listening to you, and the points which you expressed were definitely very valid. And we will see with your support how we can include in the specific code of conduct for direct selling. Now I'm requesting Madam Roberta to speak first, and I'm also requesting Nirupama. We want you to speak in the end, since you are the torch bearer. Listen to all the views and then tell us, how we can make specific code of conduct for direct selling industry. So over to you, Miss Roberta.
Hello, everyone. For you, it's good afternoon. For me, it's good morning. It's a great pleasure to share my thoughts and my experience in direct sales industry. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Associated Chambers of Commerce and Industry of India for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I'm just give you an overview about how things work here in Brazil. And unlike some countries like Colombia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Korea, we do not have a national law that regulates the activity on direct sales or multi-level marketing, okay? Neither it's necessary to obtain special registration or license to operate in the country as a direct selling company. All companies, on the other hand, must have their registration as a legal entity, registration as a taxpayer, and specific registrations and license depends on the products that the company sells. For example, if the company sells cosmetics, the company should go before the Ministry of Health to get those license and registration. And in case of nutritional products, for example, they need to obtain registration and license from the Ministry of Agriculture here in Brazil. Actually, here we have only criminal law of 1951, which deals with the crimes and misdemeanors against the popular economy. That is the law which is applied in cases where business owners or managers of companies are involved in schemes, okay? And in the Article 2, Item 9, the law says, obtaining or attempt to obtain illicit gains to the detriment of the people or undetermined number of people through speculation or fraudulent process such as snowball, money chains, and other equivalent, okay? The penalty can be detention from 6 to 2 years and fine, which amount depends on the seriousness of the crime, okay? In 2013, Brazil faced two huge schemes, those schemes deceived almost 2 million people and involved around 100 million of US dollars. The name of companies were Telex Free and B-Bon. Telex Free provided VoIP services, and B-Bon sold the car tracker, the device to tracking the cars, and also included the tracking services. And at that time, in response, would you like to ask something? You can interrupt anytime if you need. In response to many victim requests for a law to regulate multi-level marketing and avoid new federal schemes, 4 bills on multi-level marketing were presented in 2013 and 14. And due to the lack of knowledge on the subject, one of the bills was for final approval. Fortunately, we worked hard with some associations and unions before the Congress, and the bill was not approved. And before being voted, associations and many other representations were before the Congress and give them some consideration and suggestion for the bill. But most of the suggestions were not accepted. At the time, if the bill was approved, the direct sales market would no longer be viable in Brazil, and more than 4.5 million people would lose their small business. One of the articles, for example, required that at least 10% of the sales force should be hired as an employee. And at that time, when I was in the middle of discussion with the congressman, I asked, how should I choose which of the direct sales person would be the employee or not? Because you are requiring 10% of the total amount of direct sales people. And that would be impossible to implement since the distributor are entrepreneurs have their own small business and are not employees. Another aspect to comment on this, the legislation process in Brazil is very complex. I think in India may be complex too. And it's very difficult to guarantee the terms of law, no matter the subject. The bill, for example, to be approved here needs a simple majority votes of the Chamber of Deputies, a majority in the Senate, and finally, the president sanction. Just to have an idea about the complexity, we have 531 deputies and 81 senators at the federal legislature branch, and who is responsible for proposing, debating, and approving laws that are in the interest of the country. Another important aspect here of not having a law that regulates the industry is that the world and technology are changing rapidly, and the law cannot follow the changes at the same speed. And of course, would impact on the competition of direct sales companies with other sector companies which do not have any regulation, okay? And with the object of prevent new bills from being presented and approved, and put the industry and the free enterprise at risk, we worked with some associations and representative of sales companies, direct sales companies, very close with the government and authorities to take care of protecting consumer rights in order to educate consumers about the matter. For example, here we have 2 documents published by the Securities and Exchange Commission in partnership with the Ministry of Justice Department. Just for our information, the Securities and Exchange Commission is an autonomous entity linked to Ministry of Economy here, okay? One of the documents explains in details the difference between direct sales and scams. Another document educates about fraudulent investments. Both documents had the support of the specialists in direct sales and the Brazilian Association of Direct Sales Companies. At the Security and Exchange Commission website, these documents are available for anyone who is interested to learn about the subject or to fill in a complaint if they have contact with any scam. Well, here, the Brazilian Association of Direct Sales Company adopt the same code of conduct adopted by the World Federation of Direct Selling Companies, which is adopted for more than 60 countries all over the world. However, the code is applied only to member companies, and association in any association in Brazil is voluntary and not mandatory. And in addition to have a code of ethics, the association has a committee that evaluates and approves the business plan of all member companies. Whenever there are changes, any change in the compensation plan, for example, the company is obliged to communicate the association. And the assessment consists of verify all the requirements of the code of ethics are being fulfilled by the company. With that, consumer can consult the association's website to find out if the company has a sustainable and a legal plan. Even here, government authorities search at the association website in order to verify whether a company under investigation, for example, is a member or not. And in case of non-compliance with the rules of the code of conduct, the consumer, distributor, or company may submit a complaint to the association. And in my experience and opinion, more than have a law about the direct sales sector, it's important for companies and associations to act together with the government to protect consumers from schemes. And I think the self-code of conduct is an important tool for that. Thank you for listening to me. It's a glad being here.
Thank you, Roberta. Thank you, Roberta, for your explanation that, there are challenges in Brazil also. India is not the only country which has challenges with the regulator. So we will continue our work with the regulators. And now I request Mr. David Stanley to share his views. He is the most experienced among all of us with the direct selling business, and I really value his opinion. Over to you, Mr. Stanley. Yeah. Mr. Stanley, I think you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yes, good evening. Thank you very much, Ms. Chavi, for giving me this forum to speak. And first of all, let me say good evening to the panelists and to all the participants. And good morning to Ms. Roberta. So it's nice to have you here in this Indian forum. So I'm thankful to ASSOCHAM for giving me this opportunity to share my views in this esteemed forum. I would also like to thank all the people, who are involved in this, conducting this wonderful webinar. I would like to start my interactions with a quote. We all know our direct sales distributors are the driving force for our direct selling industry, and educating, protecting, and partnering with them will ensure a consistent growth for our industry, which has been growing leaps and bounds every year in India. In India, many direct selling entities follow the code of ethics, which has been laid down by the world body. With the enactment of the Consumer Protection Act 2019, India has taken a lead in protecting its citizens against the unstructured business practices. Each one of us, we all know, are consumers. In my opinion, the code of ethics are the highest ethical business standards for the direct selling industry, and direct selling guidelines of 2016 have been adopted in the Consumer Protection Acts to 2019 to provide a mandated series of policies which protects the consumers and makes everybody, the sellers, accountable for their actions. Responsibility for each stakeholder of the industry should be mandated with clear rules to follow, which bolster the image of the direct selling industry in India. The Consumer Protection Act 2019 is a holistic document which incorporates all the distribution channels which were earlier not there in the Consumer Protection Act. In light of the ever-changing dynamics of our Indian economy, I would like to elaborate on the objective for having a self-regulatory code of conduct for our direct selling industry in India. We want to protect the interest of the consumers and direct sellers. We want to encourage the practices of protection of information of direct sellers and the consumers. We also want to give responsible ownership to the direct sellers with respect to the responsibilities they have towards the consumers. To play an important role in the complaint redressal from customers and direct sellers. Prohibit, of course, advertising and promotion and product claims which are misleading or deceptive in nature. The code of conduct should also lay down the policy definitions which are integral to our direct selling business operations, along with obligations which lay down the foundation for ethical business practices and obligations for the direct selling entities towards the direct sellers, and also of the direct seller towards the consumers. I would now like to briefly introduce with you the salient principles which may make up the code of ethics. Context for the protection of consumers. I'll first cover this. The explanation and demonstration, order form, literature, and testimonials pooling of and return of goods should be specified, referral selling and delivery. All these points should be covered. Now, I would also like to touch upon the conduct for the direct sellers who sell our products, which will provide momentum and flourish to our discussion. The code of conduct which will envisage harmony and efficiency in the direct selling entity and should lay down clear guidelines on the following. Number one is direct sellers compliance, recruiting, and the business information. What are the remunerations? Earning claims to be made by the sellers, relationship, termination, inventory, and the direct seller training available. At this point, I would like to thank one and all for this opportunity to share with you the need for self-regulatory code of conduct for the direct selling industry. And I'm looking forward to the speakers, Madam Suchitra and of course, Madam Nirupama, to come and speak after me. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Stanley, for an elaborate and very crisp and to the point, points which you mentioned just now. And we will definitely take it forward. Suchitra, now it's over to you. You have already seen the guidelines, but we want to make is a specific code of conduct for India.
Thank you. I have a brief presentation lined up. So would it be possible for me to share it with all? Yeah, great.
Kaushal or the IT technology department at backend, can you support us?
Yes. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes, we are able to see the screen.
Okay, great. Give me a moment. Hi. So it is indeed a privilege for me to be part of this esteemed the group that looks at the direct selling, very passionate about how the regulatory framework needs to be, how how the code of conduct. The main thing that we all identify is that ethical code of conduct, right? So in this context, what I would like to present before you is probably how there could be different regulatory models that can be approached and possibly that can help the direct selling industry. So as my friend Mr. David Stanley has already mentioned about self-regulation, I would like to take it a step ahead in terms of that. So in terms of how self-regulation and state regulation, definitely we understand that self-regulation has the pros associated with it. And David Stanley has clearly demarcated as to how it is a pro-consumer approach. But there could also be issues of probably pragmatic issues do come into picture, and it could also be in those lines where self-regulation, it could be that the functions and the financial independence that is required from the government may not be possible. So of course the self-regulation has its own merits and it is highly recommended. Another model is generally the state regulation that we see in terms of the state being the regulator. But what I would typically an alternative approach that we can look at is co-regulation. And why co-regulation is specifically because of this model, or it is one of those accurate models which are designed where you have an industry and the state coming into picture. And the benefit is that probably we can have two levels of grievance redressal mechanism that can be done. So we can obviously have a self-regulatory approach, self-regulatory authority as the association. And in the second level, probably we could also look at independent regulatory authority. So this is one format of it. So in that context, if we look at what are the possible other methods, the interesting aspect comes into picture, that's the regulatory sandbox approach. why I would say this is one of the ideal or which can be customized in terms of now I think the key word or the buzzword is customization. So customization in terms of how probably industry, the direct selling industry could look at. So regulatory sandbox is basically a concept that enables the firms or the industry to test the products and services or the business models per se with such regulator obligations, but not so stringent in that matter. And compliance regulatory requirements, the burdensome, are not provided within that sector. So it is basically to have a live testing that can be done. It is also under a prevented environment or regulatory environment is provided. The most important aspect is we also would have certain regulatory relaxation or regulatory leniency that is provided, which of course the direct selling industry would also be benefited. And also in those lines, there would also be a limited purpose in which we are testing this regulatory sandbox approach. And the most important aspect is, see, when the buzzword is change and the innovations, I think this regulatory sandbox approach is one of the key aspects that possibly that we can look at. And to give you an example, probably when fintech sector was evolving, RBI had provided this kind of an approach, that is a regulatory sandbox approach, which helped to control the nuances, because we are dealing with such kind of an atmosphere or an environment where we do not know what is lying on, probably what are the innovative methods that are required, probably how do we deal with a conflict situation and things of that sort. So I would definitely provide, when we talk about whether it's the code of conduct or in terms of the ethical code of conduct, because we understand this is the matter, but there could also be possible regulatory hinges that would apply. And in that context, regulatory sandbox is a best approach. Yeah, and so probably what do we talk, or what is it that we look forward? The best example or so regulatory sandbox approach that I had mentioned is also part of a governmental or experimental governance. And why we say experimental governance is because in certain of the occasions we are not clear, or even the government or the industry might have some certain gray areas. And it also on those lines when we say that we do not have the correct or the exact answer that is required. So what are the options that are possible? It is definitely adaptable and innovative solutions to come up with such regulatory mechanisms which has the mode of adaptability to the situations or problems that would arise. It could also be a citizen, people, or a problem-oriented operational methods that we can devise for. And for a simple example, we could say that in the current scenario where the model regulation has started functioning, and we also realize that there are certain difficult situations that would arise. Like for example, in the first introduction, we said that we are people who would love to talk or to meet and discuss. The industry it's pro in that sense, but unfortunately in this kind of a situation we are unable to do so. So this is just an example. So probably in such situations where difficult situations arise and we are not able to have that kind of difficult junctures are arriving, these can be mitigated through an experiential governance. And the most important aspect is, unlike a state regulation or a self-regulation mode where stricter penalty and things of fines and things of that kind of on a penal note, it is a regulatory lenience that is required. So this also kind of mitigates, or this model of governance is something that we can adopt as far as direct selling industry is concerned. We can also look at probably how this is benefited for our industry. So with these words, I would conclude by saying that see, when government provides for, this is a relaxed approach which will allow to function in a protected environment where we have specific difficulties, or when we say that, like for example, when Anand sir was mentioning that, okay, in terms of consumer being the consumer at every point of time, the consumer, the dispute arises, the cause of action arises from the home. So home becomes that becomes an issue, or wherever that jurisdiction within the home is concerned, you are able to file the case. So in that context, probably issues of online dispute resolution mechanism would come into picture. So then we also need to look at how probably that can be, that is helpful in terms of our direct selling industry. So it could be because of all of these, each and every issue that is required. So I think this is roughly about how we can move forward. And thank you. It is indeed a great privilege to be with you. Thank you so much.
Dr. Sujitra, I have a question for you. Can you elaborate on the recommendations which you are talking about, giving relaxation to the industry? Because industry has suffered too much every time and even now. So what are the relaxations we can ask from the government, keeping in mind not just the COVID times, but generally, because we are one industry which provides a lot of opportunity for self-employment?
True. So it is in these contexts that I would say, like for example, if there are issues of a grave situation, probably, of course. So we remember how probably the case as far as Amway director was concerned. So such situations, because we understand that technically the issue wasn't in those lines, right? So in that context, I would say that probably we can, if there is a relaxed approach in the sense not having stringent. So when it comes to regulatory sandbox, or even on a whole of experimental governance, there could be different stages. The first, this is something that we had already experimented over in the Europe, may not be exactly in the direct selling context, but also in the other sectors as well. So there are different levels of the experimental governance that take place. That could be application stage, preparation, testing, and evaluation. So when there is certain of an issue that the industry faces, or it is not specifically that is required that the penal provisions are invoked on an average, on the first note itself, unless it is a grave situation. So there could be certain relaxations that we can be provided. So this is in that context that I would say that how possibly that could help in that way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sujitra. And now I invite the torchbearer of the industry, Miss Nirupama Sundarajan. She is an advocate for the industry and is always ready to speak and stand for us. So welcome, Nirupama. We can't see you.
I know, unfortunately, the alleged torchbearer is having some troubles with the computer. So you may be able to see me, but I'm connecting through audio on my phone. So if my computer decides to be friendly, you may get to see the face. Otherwise, it's just going to be me over the audio. But I hope I'm clear, though.
Yes, you are very clear, very clear. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I can see all of you. If my camera turns on, well and good. So I have been listening. I know I haven't been on video for the better part of the entire webinar, but I connected through my phone very early on, in case of a trouble. So I have been listening to every single person, and typically as a researcher, taking down incredibly detailed notes for myself. So I think largely there are 2 or 3 things that I would like to talk about. One is Chavi, as you said in the introduction, I have been studying the sector, for a lack of a better word, or been associated with the sector now for quite some time, and almost I think 10 years now, since 2010, and I've been as an outsider to the sector, in the sense that as a researcher I'm not directly involved with the sector, so I bring up a certain third person perspective to it. I have seen the sector evolve from the first time I started to get to know it to where it stands today. Now, the first thing we need to remember when we're talking about regulation is, and this comes from purely a third person perspective, the direct selling sector is not an easy sector for regulators to understand. let's be very honest, they don't get it because the models are complicated, the way the compensation packages are structured are complicated, the terminology is different. It's a whole set of things that most people just don't understand. And given how the bureaucratic structure in India works, by the time you're through explaining, going through it with one person and they move on, the next person comes in, it's always been a problem. Now, this is something you need to acknowledge and understand. And for any kind of regulatory framework to work in favor of direct selling, where you're able to actually benefit from the regulation, so to speak, is this particular aspect has to be corrected somewhere. The sector has to become more simple to understand. Take e-commerce, for example, also a very recent phenomenon, unlike direct selling, which has been around for many, many years. E-commerce came about, new terminologies being used, a whole set of things happening, and yet today regulators are able to understand the business of e-commerce much better and faster than they are able to understand the business of direct selling. Now, it's probably necessary for the industry, the direct selling sector, to sit down and think, why is this the case? Why is it that this is a problem? And I think this is a way of actually also to some extent trying to figure out whether your own processes that you've probably built as far as industry is concerned, or the way you function, you've kind of in an effort to maybe differentiate yourselves from one another, and to bring in that added advantage that each brand would claim that they have. Maybe the processes, the element of standardization or even basic standardization, I think, has disappeared. Starting from something as simple as terminologies. Now, one of you says direct selling agent, some of you say customer representative, some of you say something else. The fact that for that one person who kind of facilitates or actually goes out and does the sale through whichever model, there are at least 18 different or 15 different terms that I have come across myself. And the problem is not just that, it is also that each term means different things to different people. Now, how do you expect a state as in this government to come out with a set of rules using terminology that is standardized and consistent across board? So if I say direct selling agent today, I don't know who I mean. Neither does the regulator, and I don't think even the industry knows what they exactly have in mind. So this leads to a lot of complication in terms of wording, and it also leads to a lot of confusion as far as understanding the intent. Because for the regulator themselves, they're not entirely sure who it is that they're looking to regulate, and they don't know what term it is that they need to pick. Now, I'm saying this because as a person who's tried to understand your sector from outside, with having nothing in the background and having to literally speak to people more and more and more, and to just get a sense, it's taken me maybe around as long as it has to get a fairly good understanding of the sector. But it's been a journey. And it's been a constant interaction. Regulators don't have that advantage. So that's the first point. So I think before you even look at talking of getting suitable regulations and asking government to make a certain, asking for guidelines that work better in your favor, I think the industry, the sector needs to sit down. Oh, I think I'm on now. So the sector needs to sit down and collectively look at standardizing something as basic as terminology that each of you use in terms of your either business plan, in terms of your everyday words that are there. You need to have a lexicon, and that has to be consistent. My true belief is the moment you standardize a certain set of definitions in term or certain terminologies, you will see regulation, and the regulator will become that much more comfortable in terms of how to regulate you, what to regulate, and how to go about it. And I think this is a starting point that as industry you should take up. This is my first thing. The second thing is, I think, through the course of what I've been listening, there are three things I've been hearing. I'm not a lawyer, but having worked with policy, these are three things that I've come across. So one thing I've been hearing is regulation, of course, as part of the Consumer Protection Act, and there is regulation. The second is I've been hearing self-regulation. And the third is I'm hearing code of conduct. Now, the second and third are being used in some kind of joint or interchangeable manner. To me, they are all three different things. Code of conduct is something that industry adopts. You lay it down and people adopt it voluntarily. Enforcing it doesn't happen legally. Enforcing it can happen through what I'm going to call very loosely peer pressure amongst, fellow industry mates, and to ensure that it gets done. And whatever happens within the group. It's got nothing to do with the state or regulations or anybody there. Self-regulation is somewhat almost like co-regulation that Dr. Menon spoke about, where you have a body that is largely run by industry as well, which has taken on a certain onus of regulating themselves, and which is also in some sense governed by an overarching regulation that is a regulator. So the easiest example that most people understand probably is that of capital markets and mutual funds, where you have AMFI, which operates, I think, as a self-regulatory association, and you have SEBI, which continues. The other one, of course, is your microfinance companies. You have self-regulatory organizations that regulate your microfinance companies, and you also have them actually under, I think, currently DFS, Department of Financial Services, and RBI, of course, to some extent. But you have these structures. But for you to become a self-regulatory organization, it's not that you just get up one day and declare yourself to be one. There is a certain process that needs to be followed. And for that to happen as an association, you will have to establish yourself well, make sure that what you're doing, and you'll have to have the collective agreement of at least a certain percentage of people in your industry. Not everyone can just pick up and go and say, today I will be a self-regulatory organization. So for that, collective consensus amongst your industry players is also important. The last is code of conduct. Now, I, as a person, think code of conducts are very essential for any set of, group of companies functioning and working. But the question that industry needs to ask itself is, who's going to enforce your code of conduct? Now, if you're going to say at the end of the day that here is a code of conduct I'm putting in, and we will trust each one of you to adopt it, it really, forgive me, but I don't really believe in that intrinsic goodness of people as much. And typically then you're maybe just half a step better than where you were, in that you formulated a code of conduct. But there must be a way in which you amongst yourselves and your peers are also able to ensure that it is adopted in the spirit that it's been done, and that it is also enforced in a similar manner. Associations, I can't stress enough, play a very, very important role. But I know that with the direct selling sector, even though there are associations, my experience has been that associations don't necessarily talk to each other and are not always on the same page. Now, from a regulator point of view, when I see multiple associations at war with each other, literally openly, and I don't see consensus amongst industry players and industry participants, it sends me a very wrong signal and a very bad signal. I think you're fractured in whichever way you are. And I also don't know which one is legitimate, which is not legitimate. Although all of you will be and maybe are legitimate, I have no way of knowing, because there's no way of me assessing it, and the industry is not coming together. So when, as a collective group, the sector fails each other, is when regulators typically become extremely intrusive in the way they regulate. They would regulate you. And if you think the regulator is being incredibly harsh, and I agree on many occasions they've been incredibly harsh, but it is also a point, maybe a second, to look at why that is the case. And for that to stop, I think as a sector, all of you will have to come together more, which I don't see that much. I draw my parallel having worked with the gems and jewelry sector. Now, jewelers are as many in numbers as you have direct sellers working. Now, they are also a community which is small, large, big chains. I mean, they're spread across the country. But look at how well they're organized within their associations. They speak collectively in one voice, which is why today when the associations go, they may get along, not get along, but at the end of the day, they speak collectively in one voice. I haven't seen that with direct selling. And I think that's something that industry should look at. The last point I'd like to make actually is on Dr. Menon's idea of a regulatory sandbox. I am of a slightly different opinion. I, in fact, don't agree with the system of a regulatory sandbox. The reason why I don't agree is because I don't think the problem with direct selling regulations is that you're over regulated or it's too much of a regulation for reasons that I've just explained. I think there is a lack of clarity in which who's supposed to regulate you and what exactly needs to be regulated. And I don't think that comes because the business is new, hardly, or that the processes aren't well laid out. It's not it. There is a huge disconnect between regulators and what is being regulated in terms of how the business works. So a regulatory sandbox, while usually it's a great idea from the point of view of trying to see experimentative regulations. I think what you need now are not experimentative regulations. You just need a very clear, defined framework saying, this is my regulator, this is my regulation, this is the ambit of my regulation, and this is what I do. Currently, that doesn't happen. You get caught under all kinds of cases, you get clubbed with all kinds of businesses, and all kinds of regulations kind of fall on your head every time something goes wrong at multiple levels. In terms of fixing where liability lies, to what extent liability lies, who stays accountable, who doesn't. I think these are elements that need to be looked at internally. These are certain key elements that, in terms of educating not just the public, but also regulator. For direct selling in sector, if you ask me, you need to be undertaking a lot more outreach, not just with the peers that you are talking to and people like us who have access to these platforms, but in a very targeted manner with your policy makers, in that you say, here it is. And for that, I can't stress this enough, that I think a certain level of standardization is the first thing that the industry should bring in together. And I think that has to be spearheaded by yourselves. And it also shows a more proactive approach for the regulator to say, okay, at least they're getting their act together, they're doing something. Now I'll be willing to come and listen to you. Thank you.
Very well spoken, Nirupama. Absolutely to the point. Being with the industry, I agree with you on most of the points. So taking a cue from what you're saying, that, regulators definitely are unable to understand our business. And we have tried to come with specific terminology. Like, we all talk about the word compensation, whereas compensation is usually given in an employer and an employee relationship. So the first step could also be, instead of calling it compensation, it should become a sales incentive plan, because if we look at it is sales which is happening. I would want Mr. David Stanley and even Abhishek, both of you from the industry, to comment on specifically this. Can we take this first step? I know just 2 companies, but we will try and convince more people as well. Mr. Stanley, you are not audible. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Unmuted. Okay, that was a very utopian situation Ms. Nirupama had drawn. That's where we all like to reach in the long run. Anyway, it was nice, very professional views you have put forward. Being diverse or using different terminologies is not a direct sales thing. It's a human thing, For example, whenever I go to the United States, I say you're driving on the wrong side of the road. And whenever they come to India, they say you are driving on the wrong side of the road. So if you see the cell phone companies, they have 10 different charges for 10 different phones, Sometimes even one company has got different models, different charges. So that's how human beings are. So we are also like that. We are using different terminologies. I don't think in our generation we will see people all using same terminologies for everything. That's a thing which we have to live with. But there's also an important thing. These are the things which gives consultants like Chavi him a chance to do business, because when people do not understand the industry, they can go to Madam Chavi and she can guide them, especially the regulators. And she's handled a lot of regulators during her time in the Indian Direct Selling Association. So yeah, that's the thing which, but definitely we all agree that we need to look at in the long run having a similar terminologies. So it's easier for the distributor, direct selling distributors, if they want to move from one business to another, they can understand easily, and also for the regulators and for everybody else. Yes, it's a good point.
Abhishek,
I
over to you.
also totally agree with Ms. Narupama that there should be a common terminology for the direct selling industry, because it's very confusing for the people, to understand. And if we are talking about the, guidelines and the legitimate system and everything, there should be a proper common terminology, like for the direct sellers, what we use, like for the plans, and like for the even for the levels also. I must say that there should be a common terminology that the government shouldn't get any problem in understanding what we do, how we do, to get the transparency and to get the clarity on the business purpose. It must be needed, and I would definitely look upon it and try to maintain the terminology as per the industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you, Abhishek. Miss Roberta, would you like to add any comment to the discussions which we've had today regarding India, and any suggestions from your end?
Yes, there is no a common sense, of course, because each country has its own specialty or the way to do business. And but I agree with Miss Nirupama, because actually every single company calls the distributors in the different way. They call the business plan and compensation plan in a different words, just to skip of being confused with some schemes. But at the bottom line, all the consumers are not able to understand actually our industry. This is my opinion.
Over to you, Mr. Patwardhan. Now you are from the consumer, you have done so many things within the consumer ambit and the consumer protection law. So now, since the industry is taking a step with the support of ASSOCHAM to come with a specific code of conduct, how will you guide us that we take forward, so that we take cues from Nirupama, Dr. Suchitra, and also from you, and carve out some 10, 12 points with the support of ASSOCHAM team, the government, that this is what we want.
I think the definitions that have been brought in by the Consumer Protection Act should be the definitions that we either adopt, or maybe even if we want to improve on that, make suggestions in that direction, so that there's no duplication of defining a particular term. The worst situation that we are seeing today is, while a consumer who buys goods or avails of any service for commercial purpose, now that term commercial purpose is not defined anywhere in any of the laws anywhere in the world. And that's one of the issues. How do you define what's commercial purpose? I mean, at one point of time, we had a judgment from the Supreme Court which says, if you are having a current account with any bank, that is commercial purpose. Now, how do you define just holding a, whether it's a savings bank or a current account, how does that make it commercial purpose? If the bank has maybe cheated you, or maybe levied wrong charges, or probably dishonored a check which it should not have, in such situation, if you approach the consumer fora, it's a current account, so then it's banned because it's commercial purpose. I mean, that was something which was quite ridiculous. And well, it took us a long time to get that concept cleared from the consumer courts. But even today, in spite of the new Consumer Protection Act in hand, this term is not defined. Similarly, there would be many other issues, particularly now, like I said, if the consumer is going to be filing a complaint because he has placed an order from his residence, the particular product was delivered at his residence, in that case, there has to be, of course, now we have got this webinar here. Even the courts today are functioning on a virtual hearing, whether it's the Delhi Supreme Court or National Commission, or even here High Courts. We have been appearing in the mornings on virtual court. But now there has to be something like a pan-India common platform on which there would be everyone who can access and reach the courts and be able to appear to defend himself. That's one of the major issues, because otherwise in Maharashtra we had already started with e-filing, some time back. But then that was given to a private company, and the private company was handling it on its own. Whereas we have NIC, the national, I think, some NIC of India, who is handling for all the courts in India. In such situation, there has to be such kind of a common pan-India platform where it is approachable, and anyone can reach the court saying that, yes, I would like to defend myself. That is something that needs to be pressed, because that's going to be a big mess, not only for manufacturers, but it's percolating down to sellers. And even the definition of a seller has been defined over here. So that's how that needs to be addressed, because seller is anyone who even not just sells, who even propagates, or even someone who is putting up his own label becomes a manufacturer who is selling. And the product liability gets cast upon even the seller. Now that is something which also needs to be addressed, and we need to have a particular code of conduct by which there are certain provisions or provisos by which there are certain exemptions granted. I made a nice write-up, and that's what I was trying to say. If I can have it put up, so that the various provisions of the Consumer Protection Act, those things could be placed before us while when we are deciding on the code of conduct. That would help.
What we will do in that case is, Mr. Patwardhan, that we will probably have a webinar or a Zoom call where where we can discuss with you internally and see what best solution we can bring up for direct selling industry, specifically the code of conduct. So today, unfortunately, we will not take it further since we are already crossed the time. And I also would like to say that over the last year, we've been involved, all of us over here, for last 10-15 years. We've seen that the industry was very small in 2008, just about 3,000 crores when I met Mr. David Stanley. Subsequently, now we are at 10,000 crores. But in this 10-year period, 12-year period, it is not that the industry has been consistent. We've grown at 23%, then we've dropped to 17%, and we even came to 4%. And now again, there is a lot of momentum within the industry to focus on sales. So in case we can come up this unified platform which we have been able to create because of ASSOCHAM, if we can take this forward, I am 100% sure that we will be able to transform the industry to a large extent. That is why I wanted to specify that to a large extent, taking feedback from Mr. Ashish Gupta from Altos and Mr. David Stanley from Helix, that how we can come at a common platform. And of course, Mr. Stanley, you will also have to support, because you are someone who understands the industry and is also in touch with all the other players of the industry. So you will have to support us in taking this mission of ours forward with the other industry players. With that, I say bye to everyone. Thank you all for joining. And also, I would like to thank our sponsors, Vestige India, for sponsoring our webinar. Thank you all, and we should see you next month along with ASSOCHAM for something new which we will decide and share with all. Thank you, Mr. Rajora. Thank you, ASSOCHAM.
Thank you everyone from ASSOCHAM, and my special thanks to all the speakers. And we'll meet again after a month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.